Jesse James never set out to be a legend. He just wanted to breathe. That's the part most stories skip right over. Before the robberies, before the headlines, before anyone started painting him as some gun-slinging Robin Hood, Jesse James was just a teenage guerrilla. He wasn't some mythic outlaw. He was a kid, shirtless on a filthy, blood-soaked mattress, gasping for air, his chest torn open by a Union bully. There was nothing glamorous about it. No six-shooter heroics, just the wet, rattling sound of a punctured lung and the panic in his mother's eyes as she pressed a rag against the wound, desperate to keep him alive. The real focus here isn't Jesse, the outlaw. It's Jesse, the patient, a 19-year-old, helpless, sweating through a Missouri summer with a hole in his chest and a fever burning him up. Back then, survival didn't look like the movies. It looked like a house full of fear, a body slick with sweat and blood, and a desperate hope that whatever counted as medicine wouldn't kill you faster than the bullet. Forget the Hollywood version, where Jesse shrugs off a gunshot and rides off the next day. In 1865, Missouri was a war zone. Fields were burned, houses raided, families hunted down for their politics. The James family lived right in the middle of it. In Little Dixie, a stretch of farm country so bitterly divided that you might swap crops with your neighbor one week and gunfire the next. Jesse and his older brother Frank rode with Confederate guerrillas, fighting a private, brutal war long after the regular armies marched out. And, eventually, that war crashed through their own front door. Jesse's story nearly ended in those final, savage months of the Civil War. He'd already seen enough to last a few lifetimes. Men scalped, homes torched, even his stepfather tortured by Union soldiers just a few yards from the family table. But battlefield misery is one thing. A wound like this is its own kind of hell. There are records. Jesse, hit in the chest, barely alive, dragged home by his brother or his comrades. No ambulance, no hospital. Just a frantic carriage ride, a door thrown open, Jesse dumped on his own bed, shirt cut away, skin pale as tallow, a ragged hole just beneath his collarbone, oozing blood. That was the opening act. The real ordeal started when his family realized they were his only hope. They did what families did in those days, pressed any cloth they could find to the wound, swapped them when soaked, and prayed he wouldn't drown in his own blood. There was no anesthesia. They might have splashed whiskey down his throat if he could keep it down. No antibiotics, just water and whatever herbs you could mash up. And that constant threat that infection might finish what the bullet started. Every time Jesse coughed, it was a fresh agony. Every breath risked sucking air into his chest cavity and collapsing his lung further. The air in the room, if you can imagine it, hung heavy, coppery blood, sweat, and the early stink of infection. This wasn't just a practical nightmare. It was a sensory assault. Bandages would stick to raw flesh and have to be peeled away, making Jesse bite his tongue to keep from screaming. Sheets turned slick with sweat and blood, the mattress practically fermenting with the smell. Flies gathered as the summer air thickened. The house fell into a strange, tense quiet, broken only by Jesse's ragged breathing and the nervous steps of his mother, Zerelda, who had to become nurse, surgeon, and priest all at once, changing his dressings by candlelight with trembling hand. And in those early days, there wasn't even a doctor, just a family, doing what they could. And somehow, Jesse survived, at least at first. His recovery slogged on for weeks, then months. the wound refusing to close. A bullet, or a piece of it, would stay buried in his lung for the rest of his life. But we'll get to that twist. For that first stretch, nobody was thinking about the legend of Jesse James. The question was simple and brutal. How do you keep a teenage son alive with a hole in his chest on a dirt floor with nothing but rags, whiskey, and hope? That first night, there were no legends, just blood, fear, and the ugly reality of what it took to survive a bullet in 1865. And for Jesse, that was just the beginning. Survival at the James farmhouse wasn't about heroic willpower or divine intervention. It was a bitter, hour-by-hour fight against blood loss, infection, and the limits of frontier medicine. The days after the wound settled into a brutal rhythm. Mornings meant peeling away bandages glued to his chest with dried blood and whatever else had leaked out overnight. If you think peeling off a bandage from a skinned knee hurts, try picturing it on a wound the size of your fist, with the added suspense that the next thing to come off might be an actual piece of you. Zerelda had to do this. Her hands shook, her jaw was set, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Squeamishness wasn't an option when your son's life depended on it. There's a certain silence that takes over a sick room, thick, oppressive, broken only by the hiss of breath and the slow, sticky sound of cloth peeling away from flesh. The wound was a constant question mark. Sometimes it oozed clear, which was a good sign. Other days it turned cloudy or yellow, and suddenly the whole house was holding its breath, waiting to see if the rot would start to spread. In the 1860s, nobody had a name for sepsis, but everyone recognized the fever, the chills, the wound that wouldn't close, and the slow, sick certainty that nothing, no prayer, no poultice, was going to save you if that infection took hold. Jesse, meanwhile, drifted in and out of feverish dreams, shivering beneath a mountain of blankets, while sweat pooled underneath him. Every cough was a gamble between agony, blood, and panic. Sometimes the wound would actually bubble with each breath, a pinkish foam at the edge of the bandage. That's the kind of detail Hollywood skips over, because there's no way to make it look heroic. It's just desperate. So let's talk about pain. There was no morphine at hand, no miracle cures. If you were lucky, you got whiskey or a poultice that stung more than it soothed. Mostly, the cure for pain was to grit your teeth and hope they didn't crack. By the end of the first week, Jesse's lips were chewed and raw. He muttered nonsense in fever, begged for water, then spat it out because every swallow stabbed straight through his chest. The routine never changed. Pain, a snatch of sleep, waking to more pain, another bandage change, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the bleeding had slowed for good. The rest of the James family ran on nervous autopilot. Zerelda boiled water when she could, though it was mostly just lukewarm from the stove. She wrung out old rags, sometimes cut from dresses or bed sheets, sometimes just whatever fabric hadn't already been ruined. Cleanliness was a moving target. Insects found their way in. Flies hovered at the window, drawn by the smell of blood and infection. Sometimes they'd even land on Jesse's wound, until someone shooed them away. Nobody in Hollywood ever shows the flies. If you want to know what 19th century wound care really looked like, forget the gentle, sterile rituals of modern medicine. For Jesse's family, it was a daily ritual of tearing away stuck cloth, dabbing at raw tissue that wouldn't close, hoping that what came off was just pus and not a piece of dying flesh. If you wanted a real medical education out here, you didn't need a diploma, just a loved one with a wound and the grit to do what had to be done. The air in Jesse's room became its own ecosystem, humid, sour, thick with the iron of blood, the must of sweat, and that sharp, unmistakable edge of infection. When the fever ramped up, Jesse's skin went waxy and pale, his eyes sinking back in his skull. Zerelda would wipe his brow with cool cloths, praying with every movement. Frank, Jesse's older brother, would pace outside the room, not daring to come in, maybe because seeing his idolized little brother reduced to this was too much to bear. Time blurred. Now and then, Jesse would rally, manage to sit up, only to collapse back, gasping for air. The wound, instead of healing neatly, would scab and then crack open again, leaking fresh blood and pus. Meals were a joke. Watery broth, a splash of whiskey, maybe a crust of bread. Most of it Jesse couldn't keep down. When he coughed, flecks of blood sometimes stained whatever rag he pressed to his lips. If this were a Western, this would be the heroic recovery montage, the outlaw wrestling himself back to health in a week. In reality, it was a slog. Every new dawn brought a new complication, higher fever, deeper cough, a smell even family couldn't ignore. Maybe someone tried a folk remedy, a poultice of onion or plantain, hoping to draw out bad humors. All it really did was stain the bandages and add another weird scent to the room. Here's the truth. Nothing was guaranteed. The James family never knew if the next day would bring a bit of improvement or the end. Survival was a coin toss. And when you're half dead, stuck in a bed that reeks of infection, every hour drags on like a year. The myth of Jesse James wasn't forged by outsmarting the law. It was built day by painful day, by not dying, by outlasting his body's urge to quit. But eventually, something shifted. The bleeding slowed. The wound scabbed over enough to take the edge off the pain, and the fever, while it never truly broke, began to let up. Jesse could finally move a little without blacking out. He still had the cough, the limp, the constant ache in his chest, but somehow, the roulette wheel of 19th century medicine landed on survive. He was still gaunt, weak, haunted, but he was alive. In that farmhouse, with nothing but rags, whiskey, and stubbornness, it counted as a minor miracle. Of course, anyone who's ever crawled back from serious sickness can tell you surviving is not the same thing as recovering. After weeks in bed, Jesse could barely lift his head, let alone ride a horse. First attempts to stand ended, with him collapsing onto the splintered floorboards. Muscles wasted away, joints stiffened, skin clung to bone, and the wound, it never fully closed. Deep inside, that bullet, or a decent chunk of it, remained, shifting with every breath, ready to kill him all over again if it moved. Jesse and his family had won the first, ugliest battle, not dying outright. But life after the wound was its own ordeal. Weakness, pain, and the constant threat of infection became as much a part of Jesse James as any revolver or wanted poster. Hollywood loves the tidy recovery arc, but in reality, survival meant living every day with the memory and the unhealed reality of a wound that almost finished you. And for Jesse, that reality was just getting started. If Jesse James ever became a myth, it wasn't because he was physically unstoppable. If anything, it was the opposite. His body never let him forget the wound. That bullet from months ago, it stayed in his chest, a permanent souvenir from Missouri's private war. Every breath too deep, Every wrong twist, every attempt to stand was a reminder that death was never more than a slip away. Surviving a gunshot to the chest in an era before anyone understood germs wasn't a testament to toughness. It was a daily, humiliating reminder you weren't in control. Mobility? Forget it. The legend says Jesse rode out for vengeance, but in reality, those first weeks he was lucky to crawl. Muscles wasted down to string and bone, skin rubbed raw from days on sweat-soaked sheets, legs trembling if he even tried to swing them over the edge of the bed. Walking from his bed to the door was a day's journey. Riding a horse or robbing a bank might as well have been a trip around the world. These are the weeks nobody sings about. Jesse, shuffling around his own house, clutching his chest, coughing up flecks of blood, limbs shaking. His mother guarding the room like a battlefield nurse, praying no new fever or infection would finish what the bullet started. If you want the truth, recovery wasn't a dramatic movie montage. It was one long humiliation, with Jesse's world shrunk to 4 walls, 2 sheets, and a relentless ache that just would not quit. And the bullet? It never came out. For the rest of Jesse James's life, it sat in his lung, a slow-burning thread. Some days he could ride, shoot, and swagger, but the pain never fully left. He lived with shallow breaths, a cough that lingered for years, and the knowledge that a hard fall, a fist fight, even a bad cough might send that slug deeper or set off a fatal infection. In the real world, he was never whole again. On the frontier, weakness was a death sentence, so Jesse learned to mask it with bravado, but everyone close to him knew the wound was always there. His legend is built on stories of impossible escapes and fearless bravado. The reality was a life of calculated risk and hidden pain, never knowing if today's ache was just another reminder or the start of something worse. That's the version Hollywood never shows, not the quick-draw showdowns or the dramatic escapes, but the messy, grinding aftermath, the pus, the fevers, the stink, the long days spent praying for pain to let up. Jesse James didn't become a legend because he was invincible. He became a legend because he stared down death again and again and kept moving, if you can call limping, coughing, and surviving with a bullet in your lung moving. His fame wasn't built on outlaw romance or Robin Hood charity, but on pure, ugly, physical survival. So next time you see Jesse James on a movie poster, guns blazing, chest out, remember what the real Jesse carried. Not just revolvers, not just a reputation, but the ache, fear, and filth of a wound that almost killed him. Nobody sings about the crawl from bed to chair. Nobody immortalizes the stench of infection or the terror of a fresh cough. But if you want the story of America's most famous outlaw stripped down to the bone, that's where you'll find it, in the battered chest of a man who survived, not by heroics, but by being too stubborn or just too lucky to die. If you want more outlaw legends with all the myth burned off, stick around and subscribe. We tell the stories Hollywood won't touch, and we don't flinch from the blood, the pain, or the truth.